If you asked me to summarize House of the Dragon in one sentence, I'd say House of the Dragon has some great episodes inside of a very frustrating season. In this video, we're going to discuss in detail exactly what I mean by that. A lot of people are very happy with what they are actually seeing on screen, but I think a lot of people would agree that House of the Dragon has yet to really hit a stride that it can maintain beyond individual episodes, where I think pacing is one of the strengths of the individual episodes, but also the weakness of the actual season. And it may annoy some of my viewers to compare House of the Dragon to Game of Thrones' first season, and while I agree we should try to grade House of the Dragon's first season on its own, the show itself, starting with the intro to each episode, doesn't seem to want to entirely disassociate itself from Game of Thrones. So in a way, House of the Dragon has asked for these comparisons, especially with the insistence of the A Song of Ice and Fire prophecy. Nothing really illustrates the biggest criticism of this season more than the time jumps, so that's exactly where we'll start. But we'll finish by touching on the individual episodes, because I think if you're a fan of this show or this George R.R. Martin extended universe, there's a lot to be optimistic about. When developing House of the Dragon and adapting this story from Fire and Blood, a question that had to be answered was, when will Season 1 start in this story? And this is where we run into the trouble, because the story technically starts when Viserys is named heir at the Great Council. That's the very first scene in this series premiere. So the Dance of the Dragons is really far off, and the war doesn't start for over 30 years. Yet we can't really tell the Dance of the Dragons with no context. Obviously we need character backgrounds and motives, but how are we going to fit 30 years into a 10-episode season? Time jumps. This is going to be the first comparison to Game of Thrones, and I'll try to make it the last in this video, although unlikely. But House of the Dragon is telling a much longer story, in regards to scale of time, than Game of Thrones. However, they're doing it with much more limited material. Fire and Blood is not A Song of Ice and Fire. From A Game of Thrones to A Dance with Dragons, we're looking at 700 to over 1100 pages per book, and that covers just over 2 years' time in the story. Fire and Blood's telling of the Dance of the Dragons is around 300 pages, covering over 30 years. It's more of a documented history. It's not a story. So for those that think House of the Dragon benefits over Game of Thrones because the showrunners are sticking to the source material and D&D started doing their own thing, that's just not an accurate characterization of what's actually occurring. Fire and Blood is not a great story. It's a textbook. The advantage it does provide is that it's a complete outline of events. A huge challenge for House of the Dragon is that many of these events are instrumental in what causes the Targaryen Civil War, so the showrunners made the decision to dedicate the whole first season to cover the 30 years leading up to the Dance of the Dragons. And this is fine, but the time jump from episode 5 to 6 leaves the audience in the dark about so many events impacting numerous characters. No character truly feels the same from episode 5 to 6, and that's okay, but the audience isn't really provided much explanation as to why. I've heard other YouTubers state that another episode after episode 5 would have helped bridge that gap a lot better, and I absolutely agree. Episode 6 really felt like a season premiere, and breaking the season up into 5-episode mini-seasons is an interesting concept, but where episode 6 felt like a season premiere, episode 5 did not feel like a finale. And so much for only comparing Game of Thrones once here, because here we go again. If you look back at Game of Thrones Season 1, each episode built up the next and ultimately fed off of the last. Where one episode ended, the next began. Bran is pushed from the tower. Episode 2 shows, at least to some extent, the impact of that on the story. And again, we have to remember the scale of time that these two stories are covering, but House of the Dragon risks the emotional investment from episode to episode because these time jumps occur episode to episode. So any backlash from like the situation between Sir Criston Cole killing Joffrey Lonmouth, that's lost. Daemon and the Vale, that's also totally forgotten, at least in episode 6. This really wasn't a problem in earlier episodes because the show didn't skip over the consequences from the prior episodes. What occurred in episode 4 with Rhaenyra immediately has an impact on episode 5. The 10-year time jump to episode 6, however, abandons a lot of questions asked from the ending of the episode 5. Further, episode 6 actually presents new questions about what occurred in the last 10 years, but we don't really get any context. Vhagar is kind of a mystery, but then is suddenly claimed and bonded with Laena. How long ago did that happen? How did it happen? Daemon and Laena have one interaction in episode 5, but now they're married with kids in a different country. Why are they in a different country? How did this all work? How did they become married? How did that work politically among the realm? Rhaenyra has carried on a secret relationship, apparently, with Harwin Strong, having him father her children, but we never once get the hint that they ever had meaningful interaction before this. Of course, book fans can fill these gaps, but as a show made for a broader audience, you're asking them to invest into characters and storylines that are essentially killed before they can truly develop. I firmly believe that there needed to be a greater bridge between episode 5 and 6. The biggest issue with these time jumps isn't the unexplained storylines exactly, but the recharacterization of Rhaenyra and Alicent is just a lot to absorb, especially when the younger version of these characters never truly got to conclude their contained story arcs. Maybe a little bit for Alicent, but not so much for Rhaenyra, because they start in episode 6 in a lot of ways new versions of these characters. Audiences are sophisticated enough to fill that gap in knowledge, but then you're trusting the audience's imagination to tell that story for you, and I don't know if that's the best idea. Now, I don't want to be overly negative here, because I do truly believe there's a lot of promise in the individual episodes, and once we get into season 2 and these time jumps calm down quite a bit, the frustration that some fans may feel with the time jumps, and I might be alone with that frustration, I'll find out after, the comment section, will hopefully feel like an outlier from the rest of the series in its entirety, where season 1 will kind of locked away as this weird, awkward thing that started this fantastic series. At least that's my hope. If you're familiar with the source material, from episode 6 on, there's only one more substantial time jump. After that, the story should stabilize itself as it gets back into the thick of the Targaryen Civil War, known as the Dance of the Dragons. Now, let's look at some of these episodes and what they do really well, but also elaborate on why they just don't feel like they always fit organically when looking at the season as a whole. Episode 1 and 2, I think, were really good introductions for book fans and more casual fans alike. I think the pacing of the first episode did a really good job at building the state of affairs, world building, and for the most part, the primary characters, and they showed the Targaryen rule was at its height under the prior King Jaehaerys. And then where there may have been some tension between, say, Daemon and Otto Hightower, then ultimately Viserys and Daemon, it's not a huge conflict among the realm yet, and more of an intimate conflict among individual characters. Yet these scenes, I think, still do a good job at planting the seeds for what will later become greater conflicts as they marinate over time. You can watch those first 2 episodes, and the small council itself, it begins to fracture and divide. Where Corlys and his house become focused on the stepstones without the support of the crown, plus the rejection of a marriage between Viserys and Laena Velaryon, as Viserys favored to marry Alicent Hightower. The slow burn pace of events isn't to the extent of early Game of Thrones, but I do think it's better executed than that of, say, Season 7 of Game of Thrones. Again, the source material really isn't as developed as A Song of Ice and Fire. As in Fire and Blood, time skips happen even more abruptly than what we're seeing here in House of the Dragon, and with even less context. Viserys, for example, is hardly mentioned or developed, where in this show, we're seeing a much more fleshed out character with internalized thoughts and feelings that are actually expressed. In Fire and Blood, there's no POV, there's no true character development. Each episode of House of the Dragon in a vacuum really allows the actors to breathe real life into these characters, making them far more complex than the source material. This is especially true in episode 3, when Viserys truly opens up to Alicent, but also expresses that he's not totally oblivious as numerous lords in the realm approach the king about a marriage with Rhaenyra and subtly assume that Aegon will eventually become heir. Watching Viserys navigate this is far more expansive than it is in the book, as it's made clear that he's very much aware of everyone in his court has their own agenda outside of maybe Lionel Strong. The Daemon vs. Crabfeeder situation at the Stepstones, while elaborated on from the book, is probably the weakest part of the episode in regards to narrative. Visually, still look great, and there's a lot of cool moments, regardless of what you think about plot armor. But regardless of how good or bad an individual episode is, when looking back, this part of the episode just feels very detached from the rest of the season. Showrunner Ryan Condal and the writing team make a good point to be loyal to the source material, and really only expand from the original text. And where this benefits the characters a lot, For the overarching plot, the crab feeder really has become a forgettable piece of this season, and it just didn't carry much weight for the rest of the story. Episode 4 is probably one of the best episodes and establishes a lot of what will be carried on to the rest of the series as far as character consequence. It is probably the best at humanizing Alicent Hightower and really kind of driving into that relationship between her and Otto Hightower. And it offers the best contrast to the woman experience between her and then, say, Rhaenyra. Then carrying over into episode 5, they did a really good job at connecting the actions of episode 4 to the consequences seen in episode 5. Even if it's just an emotional transition for Alicent and then Otto Hightower being dismissed from King's Landing and no longer being Hand of the King. But episode 5 opens with Daemon killing Rhea Royce. Where this was a mystery in the book, there's no doubt that Daemon was involved here. But here's the problem. This seemingly has no consequence to the rest of the season, as in episode 6, Daemon and Laena are married 10 years later and Rhea Royce is never mentioned. Also, not mentioned is any context to Daemon and Laena's marriage. Now, this may be touched on in episode 7, but upon first viewing, so many situations and characters are introduced with almost no explanation, and by the time we get a hint of what's going on, like Laena Velaryon or even Harwin Strong, they're killed off before we get a real understanding of their history or the situation. Again, audiences are sophisticated enough to use their imagination to fill these gaps, but is that the goal of the showrunners? It's asking a lot of your audience when 10 years of character development is occurring off screen. I'm not sure if you would categorize this as nitpicking, and maybe later seasons will have us look back in hindsight and feel this all really works so much better than it does now. But like the Kristen Cole killing of Joffrey Lonmouth, it just seems to have no consequence in the next episode. And for me, I think that's problematic. You may disagree, and please let me know in the comment section what you guys think after going over this video. The show so far has consistently asked us to believe certain relationships without truly earning them. And to their credit, the book doesn't really give much better of an explanation of certain things either. But if we are not going to offer more context to the years leading up to the Dance of the Dragons, then the creative decision to spend a whole season on it with episodes that feel more like isolated stories like in an anthology is kind of worth a debate, right? Maybe not. Because I'll ask you to answer this in the comment section though. Is there anything that we're learning in the first season that would not work narratively in a flashback? I know my viewers, if they have a writing background, may call flashbacks lazy, but depending on execution, a lot of times they can be very effective. But I want to end this with a lot of optimism, because I really do like this show and I know this video may not express that, but I want to end this with a lot of optimism. Because I think a lot of the problems that I have with the season has a lot to do with condensing so much into one season so that they can begin the Dance of the Dragons in season 2. And when I think as critically as I can about a better way to do it, I think what they're currently doing is probably the best idea, but the episodes just don't have the best execution of continuity throughout the entire season. And that's a tall task when you have to have time jumps. My biggest concern is your more casual viewers feeling lost or confused. At the end of the day, it's their viewership that will further the Game of Thrones universe, and while I firmly believe House of the Dragon has already saved the franchise from being left in the past, and when I say franchise, I mean specifically on-screen HBO moving forward. My hope is to see this universe get back to the depth that was present in the Song of Ice and Fire books and the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones. I really like a ton about these episodes individually, minus a few choices, but I'm eager to get into the next season where the season itself is absent of these time jumps that push the pacing to its limits. Let me know in the comments section what your experience has been watching this series. I'm really excited about it. I still am a big fan. It's just these individual episodes and their continuity with the overall season. I've got some concerns, I guess some criticisms, but I don't hate the show. I actually very much like it. And lastly, I will add this for those that really enjoy my content. If you'd like to support my channel, consider becoming a member here on YouTube or donating to the channel through the thanks option on many of my videos. Warner Brothers has done a fairly good job at demonetizing a lot of my content, and yet they roll ads on my videos anyway. All proceeds will go to furthering the future and quality of this channel, but if you're watching to this point of the video, that's already more thanks than I'll ever expect. So thank you so much for watching. Until next time.